So market failure sounds like, I know sometimes when we hear that term, we think of like a market literally collapsing, or literally falling apart. And that's not really that's not at all what we mean by market failure. Now, many of the examples, we tend to look at primarily models, examples throughout economics. And a lot of the time, we are assuming that there's, that things kind of come to equilibrium, that we always get back to that place, that there are just outside forces that make markets work correctly. And for the most part, that is absolutely true. We have spent a lot of time looking at that. We know how markets tend to behave, how they behave in typical situations, and how typically, in fact, we've kind of looked at it up until now as if to say all of the time, that markets are going to reach equilibrium. They're going to eventually get to that most efficient place where supply meets demand and we have equilibrium quantity and equilibrium price, and that there are no missed opportunities, no missed transactions, and that anyone that values the good at that particular price is going to be able to procure it, and any seller that values selling the good at that particular price is going to be able to do so. But we also know that that is technically it's a theoretical fiction as well. So oftentimes it is true that the free market meaning it doesn't have any kind of government intervention. There's not any kind of regulation. The government is not setting prices. The government is not doing anything in regards to controlling quantities. Then oftentimes that is the best situation. And oftentimes that's going to result in outside forces making that market produce efficiently, and it's going to produce at a quantity and a price at a level that is going to be what we call, again, socially optimal. We'll see that word socially optimal quite again, or several times again. Now, that whole process that we've actually have looked at before, economists call that the invisible hand. The invisible hand is a metaphor, obviously. There's not really an invisible hand out there, but it's an invisible metaphor for those unseen forces, those forces that eventually cause markets to go into equilibrium. Whether that is, people's own self-interest. We're self-interested, and so we want to purchase goods and services that are going to be in our best interest, that are going to maximize our utility. Producers are self-interested. They provide services not just because it's the things that people want, but because they're going to profit from it. All of those things, self-interest, freedom of production, freedom of consumption, all of those things that are true of a free market economy, those are the forces that will eventually put things in balance and bring us to that place where markets are producing what people want and markets are producing what society kind of wants them to do. That is that invisible hand is what they call that. So arguments for the invisible hand would say the government doesn't need to get involved in things because that invisible hand is eventually going to step in and correct the market. We've seen that process. We've worked that process out of market correction. We have a shortage of something. Well, that causes the price to go up. And so eventually people won't want as much of it. And then, the shortage gets resolved. This would be an argument for the whole completely hands-off kind of a thing because the invisible hand is going to sort of take care of it. Let's again just illustrate that concept of markets, being in equilibrium and being most efficient when there is no government intervention. So we've seen all this before. So supply and demand is what we have here. It's just labeled a little bit differently. Supply is marginal cost, so that's the additional cost to society. Demand is the marginal benefit to society. And in this particular case, we're talking about pizza. The market is equilibrium at $5 and 5 pizzas being demanded. And that's equilibrium. It's the market clearing situation because nobody can be made better off in this situation without making somebody else worse off. Let's say, for example, there was some reason that the government decided there needed to be some kind of an intervention here. That this was not the best situation. Let's say in this case, they decide we only want 3 pizzas to be produced. Well, that creates inefficiency. This is all just a review of things we talked about over the semester. Because at a quantity of 3, that in that case, people are willing to pay $7 per pizza, and suppliers only need 3. So we have this, not enough being produced and actually a higher price, and it created that dead weight loss, remember. So not enough was being produced in that situation. We had missed transactions of people that would have been able to produce or would have been able to buy and can't because of this, in this case, a limit on the quantity. Let's say that the government intervened in some way and said, okay, we want more to be produced, and they want 7 pizzas to be produced. Well, in that case, what are people willing to pay for 7 pizzas? What are people willing to pay? 3. Okay, that'd be the demand end. But for suppliers, producers making that pizza, what does it cost them? 7. So then we have here, we've got too much being produced. So again, it's not an efficient situation. So the invisible hand would argue that that's why you don't want to do those things most of the time, because it actually makes things more inefficient, creating that deadweight loss. So typically, supply and demand results in efficient outcomes, no deadweight loss. Everyone that wants to make that purchase of a pizza at $5 is able to do so. Every producer that wants to make that sale of a pizza at $5 is able to do so. However, we also know, or should know, that there are situations, in fact, we have looked at some, where that's not the case, where the invisible hand doesn't exactly work, or it doesn't work well enough, or some people simply feel that it doesn't work well enough, and therefore governments should get involved, and that there should be some sacrifice of some efficiency in order to make a better situation, or really actually arguing that the situation as is, if the market left alone, isn't efficient, and the government needs to step in to do something about it to correct that inefficiency. So sometimes that invisible hand doesn't work, resulting in resources not being efficiently allocated and things not being produced in quantities that are high enough or that society wants, or in some cases things being produced too much, or things that are being produced at too high of a cost to society, so forth and so on. And we call that market failure. Okay, so market failure doesn't mean that the market totally collapses. It doesn't mean, I think we tend to think of things like the stock market crash or something when we think about market failure. Market failure simply means that the free market system is, for one reason or another, not satisfying people's wants. We don't reach a market clearing situation. They are not producing the amount that society wants, or they might be producing too much, they might be producing too little, might be producing at too high of a cost, so that there's insufficient distribution of goods in the free market. Supply doesn't exactly equal demand, or the marginal cost to society doesn't equal the marginal benefit to society. Anytime you have that, and there's some kind of deadweight loss, we call that market failure. Now, there are 4 different types of market failure. 2 of these we've already looked at, and one of them we're going to look at today, and the 4th one we'll look at Wednesday. Okay, so the first one, this is one we're going to look at on Wednesday, is unequal distribution of income. Now, part of that we actually have looked at before, because this would be the reason for things like price ceilings, rent controls and minimum wage and stuff like that. It is meant to redistribute income, or to make up for the fact that there's big income inequalities, and people can't afford rent, so we're going to lower the price of rent so that it's more affordable and more people can gain access to it. So we'll talk more about that one on Wednesday. So unequal distribution of income can result in market failure. Another one that we have looked at quite a lot, this is probably the example you have the most experience with, is imperfect competition, or market share. If you recall back to us looking at particularly monopoly, we talked about how monopolies were inefficient. Monopolies produced at a higher cost than what people wanted, that they produced less they didn't produce a socially optimal amount, and they charged a higher price than what was socially optimal. So we talked about there were times where governments might intervene and regulate monopolies. They might outright ban them, they might make certain monopolies illegal, or they might regulate them to produce more of the socially optimal point, provide subsidies or something like that in order to encourage them to produce that more socially optimal amount. That is an example of market failure. So a monopoly not producing enough and charging a much higher price, it's not efficient. The marginal benefit doesn't equal the marginal cost. So that's an example of a market failure, and a reason and a way that governments might intervene in order to correct that. Another market failure, this one we'll look at on Wednesday, and that's public goods. So we'll talk more about this one a little bit later. Public goods, though, these are goods that anybody can use, even if they're not paying for it. And there's some different categories within that, so I don't want to go too much into it now. But these also lack the incentive, unlike private goods. So markets or producers don't have the incentive to produce public goods the same way that producers in the private product market do. And so there has to be typically some kind of government incentive to force the production of public goods. And again, that's going to make more sense when we actually look at public goods on Wednesday, but that's a type of market failure. The one we're going to look at today is what's called externalities. We'll define it again in a second, but externalities, if something is external, what does that mean? Outside. It basically has to do with the benefits and the costs. Again, we're going to define it here in just a second. But it means like spillover, when there's costs and there's benefits that affect people not actually a part of the transaction, and that can be good and it can be bad. But it can mean that they don't produce, that the market doesn't produce enough of something or produces too much of something. So we'll see all that in just a minute. And so in any of these cases, the government might be called upon because that invisible hand isn't doing exactly what it needs to do, or there are these extenuating circumstances that prevent it from doing exactly what it needs to do. And so in those cases, government might be called upon. We might see government as a necessary tool in order to correct that market failure, to make sure and to incentivize production at a more socially optimal level, producing things that are the amount that society wants. Again, things like regulation of monopolies would be an example of that. The way they might say, you're going to produce this much and we'll subsidize you so that you're at least breaking even or something like that. That is an example of the government stepping in to make a more socially optimal situation, correcting a market failure. All right, so again, today we're going to be looking at these four. We're going to look at externalities. Okay, so let's talk about what externalities are and the two different types of them. And we're doing a lot of vocab today, and a lot of it is kind of building on terms and things you already know, and some of them are actually just sort of putting just sort of a finer point on some things that you already know. So an externality means that there is a spillover benefit or a spillover cost. So an externality is the situation, if you have an externality in a market situation, that means there is either a cost or a benefit to that particular good or service that affects or that pertains to people not exactly involved in that transaction. It falls on someone other than the producers or the consumers in that activity. And once you see some examples of these, you go, okay, yeah, I get that. That's not hard to understand. First, we have to get sort of these textbook kind of definitions out of the way. In other words, there are some things that if one person purchases it or purchases something or engages in some kind of activity, it may benefit not just them, it may benefit people around them. And the same is true on the production side. There could be situations where something is produced that it doesn't just cost the person who's consuming it something, it costs people around them something as well. Okay, these are externalities. So there are positive externalities and there are negative externalities. Positive externalities mean that there are extra benefits to society, spillover benefits. So when I do something, when I engage in some activity, when I purchase something, utilize something, consume some kind of good or service, it doesn't just benefit me, it might benefit everybody around me. It might benefit people I come in contact with. It might benefit my neighborhood. Depends on what it is, but it is those spillover benefits. A very basic example, and we'll go over lots of examples. Let's say that I grow nice flowers in my yard. Well, that might make me happy and provide me with utility, but that might also benefit other people in the neighborhood. They might also enjoy seeing those flowers in the garden and everything. It might enhance their property value, things like that. So there are spillover benefits to that. That's a real basic example, but you get the idea. Then there are negative externalities. Negative externalities have to do with additional costs to society. So cost involved, not just the person who's making the transaction that has to put up the cost, not just the producer who's making something that has to, put up a cost, but there's some kind of overall cost to society. For example, something like pollution. So when a factory is producing certain goods, yes, there's a cost involved there to that producer and people that purchase that product, there's a cost to them, but there's an additional cost to society. I may not be interested in that particular good that that factory is producing. I might not even care what it is. I might never buy one in my life. But there's a cost involved because of the pollution that that factory is putting into the environment that might affect me. So spillover costs, spillover benefits. Those are negative and positive externalities. Positive ones are always going to be, of course, benefits to people, additional benefits, good things. Negative externalities are always on the cost side and things that are negatively affecting other people. So what that is going to mean, it means that the benefit and the cost is not just the benefit and the cost that is involved at the time of the transaction. Okay. Now, up until now, when we have talked about benefits and costs, in other words, supply and demand, we have been referring to what is actually the marginal private benefit and the marginal private cost. So this is a little bit tedious and repetitive. There's some definitions, so we have to get through this so we understand what some of these labels are about to mean. So the market demand curve that we have been looking at for weeks and weeks and weeks now, months. The market demand curve shows us the marginal private benefit. That is the additional benefit that an individual person is going to get from consuming that good or service. And for many goods or services, that's all you're going to have. You're only going to have the marginal private benefit. It is only going to benefit the person purchasing, using, eating, whatever, consuming that product are the only ones that are going to benefit from it. That's when there are no externalities, okay? So that is the marginal private benefit. So when you see that labeled MPD at any point, that just means that that's just the demand curve is another way you can look at it. But it means it is showing the benefit only to the consumer of that product. The marginal social benefit, though, is the additional benefit to society, not just the individual purchasing, using, or consuming that product, but the overall benefit to society as a whole. You would only have a separate marginal social benefit curve if there is an externality, okay? Otherwise, those two things would be the same. So up until now, you've not seen this marginal social benefit because it's been the same as the marginal private benefit. So we label that MSB. So when you have a positive externality, you would have a marginal social benefit, a benefit that is to society as well as to the person who's consuming that product. Again, the example of planting flowers in the yard. There's a private benefit to me. There's a benefit to society that may be greater than that for enjoying those flowers and improving their property value or something like that. Okay, and then on the supply end, the market supply curve shows the marginal private cost. And what we have looked at up until now has all been about just showing the marginal private cost. The cost to individual producers for producing that good. And for many supply curves, for the supply of many goods and services, that's all there is. If there are no externalities, then you only have, or no negative externalities anyway, then you're only going to have that marginal private cost curve. However, in the instance of externalities, of negative externalities, you will also have a marginal social cost, MSC. Marginal social cost represents those spillover costs to society. So when we have a positive or a negative externality, those are represented by the marginal social cost or the marginal social benefit. Positive externalities are going to show up as the marginal social benefit. Negative externalities are going to show up as the marginal social cost. Okay, so again, now, the socially optimal point. Remember, socially optimal means that we're producing what? What does that term socially optimal mean?
Everyone that wants to buy at a given
And socially optimal means basically what society wants, what people want to be produced. And as we mentioned before, typically when you don't have externalities, that's where the market is going to end up. But when we have externalities, that means that essentially equilibrium ends up, for lack of a better phrase, in the wrong place. It's not socially optimal because the market is not taking into account those additional benefits or those additional costs. And so you have to look at it as if that equilibrium, the price and the quantity is in the wrong place. And so government intervention might be required or might be deemed appropriate in order to put it in the right place, to bring it to the socially optimal point, okay? So this graph shows us as if there were no, or you could assume there's either no externalities here, but the equilibrium, as you can see, looks like any other equilibrium we've seen. That is the socially optimal point. This is showing the pollution in this particular example. And the socially optimal point would be, and here you're talking about cleaning up pollution. Sometimes you'll see examples like that, where the marginal social benefit equals the marginal social cost, okay? All right, so let's talk about what happens when there are externalities present. Again, what that's going to mean is that the market is not producing the socially optimal quantity. It is either producing too much or it is producing too little. They're not socially optimal because it's not taking into account those additional costs or those additional benefits. And there's going to be additional costs or additional benefits depending on whether or not you're talking about a positive or a negative externality. Okay, so negative externalities result in the market producing too much. Negative externalities are always going to result in the market producing too much, more than is socially optimal. Society wants less of those things. And think about it, it makes sense. If they are negative things, if it's bad things, think of negative externalities as bad side effects we don't like, side effects we don't want. We want those producers to produce less of those things because they negatively affect us. They can be harmful, okay? So this particular graph, this shows a negative externality, okay? So what I've got here is my marginal private cost. This is, the supply curve, basically, all right? So here is the point that that society is being given. This is the production point. Equilibrium is right here at this quantity and a price right there. That's your equilibrium. But since there is a negative externality, we have to think of it as if this supply curve is basically in the wrong place because there's a negative externality associated with this. Let's say pollution. Pollution is a real common example, and it's the one you're going to see a great deal of. And it could be any kind of pollution. It could be noise pollution. It could be, anything like that. So that means that there is a greater cost to society. This only represents the cost to the producer to produce at this level. But this, the marginal social cost, represents the cost to society, because now we have to consider that this extra pollution is going into the atmosphere, and that can be harmful, and it can cause health problems, and it makes the air not as nice to breathe. It can make our water not as nice. All those different things that could come with excessive pollution. So this is the additional cost to society. So if we consider that, this is the socially optimal point. It's a lower quantity. See how the socially optimal point is a lower quantity. They want the society, or they want the producers to produce less of that thing. They are producing too much of it as it is, okay? So negative externalities, that means that there is a marginal social cost involved, an additional spillover cost to society that is involved. Positive externalities is the opposite. Positive externalities result in the market producing too little. They're not making enough. Again, think about it. If it's a positive thing, an extra benefit, things that we like, things that are going to help us, even if we're not the one consuming that good or we're not the ones consuming that service, we are going to benefit from that particular thing. So there are additional benefits, and we want society to produce more of those kind of things. Now, this is a negative externality. If I was to show a positive externality, which I think I have on the next slide, I'm pretty sure, we would see an additional benefit, a marginal social benefit. So we have to think in that case of a positive externality, it is that the demand curve is in the wrong place. And so we want a new demand curve, marginal social benefit, to show us what would be the socially optimal place to produce. So government intervention may be necessary or sometimes deemed appropriate, and you've kind of already seen this part really, to correct those externalities and lead to a situation where the production is more optimal. And if you'll notice, if you'll just look at this graph for a second, it should remind you a little bit of something we've done before. What does this kind of remind you of? Where did we see something look kind of like that previously? Without the labels. Don't look at the labels. Just look at the curve. Taxing, okay? And that's a reason for taxation. We're going to talk about that again in just a second. So we're basically about to apply, in just a moment, the same skill we looked at there when we did taxation. And how that, pushed the supply curve back, raised the price, lowered the quantity. That's how you do that. When they're producing too much and you want them to pull back on that production, put a tax on things, and that will perhaps bring it to that more socially optimal level. Okay. All right. So this is what that's going to show. So to correct negative externalities, there are a couple of things that governments can do. One of the most common is going to be taxes or other kinds of regulations. And that's usually the example you're going to see the most. That's the example you're going to be asked to illustrate the most, is a tax, in order to pull back production so that there is less being produced and it minimizes the results of that negative externality on society. So that's what this diagram here shows. You've seen this before. You've done this before. So just remember those particular skills. So here's what we have. I know that this shows me a negative externality. I know that it shows me a negative externality because this is my supply or marginal private cost, but that doesn't take into account the additional cost to society here. That's represented by this. This is my marginal social cost. So negative externalities are always going to show up on the producer side of things, and it also shows, or it results in a situation where not or too much is being produced. Here's equilibrium. This is what society is producing. They're producing here at QE and at price E, okay? But because technically, because we have a negative externality present, this supply curve is in the wrong place. This should be the real supply curve, as it were, okay? It takes into account the marginal social cost. So this is where is actually socially optimal. So this is the quantity that is socially optimal. This is the price that is socially optimal. Now, in order to get there, the government could place a tax. So at that point, this looks just like that tax diagram that we did several weeks or months ago. So if they tax by the amount of the difference between these two curves, that will pull the production back, raise the price, and lower the quantity. Okay, remember this would be the price that people will pay. This is what the producers are actually going to get. Remember the difference. This represents the tax revenue. What does this part of it represent?
Producer tax.
Or what the consumers. This is what the consumers pay. This is what the producers pay. Okay. Now, Pigouvian taxes. That is a tax. Okay, but it's specifically to correct a negative externality. So if you're taxing something for the purpose of lessening those negative benefits to society, it's not like, say, for example, if you had a tax that's to raise money to pay for education, that's not a Pigouvian tax. If you have a tax on pollution, a tax on companies that use certain chemicals so that they will be encouraged and be incentivized to use less of them because they don't want to pay the taxes on them, that's Pigouvian tax. So all of this works the same way. I don't even know if you'll see that word on the AP exam. But it's meant to correct or to lower the amount of negative externalities. This is why we have things like environmental standards as well, because they are more difficult. Well, one, it does set the rules, but if you look at it from an economic standpoint, those rules cost. In order to enforce those kinds of things, in order for companies to comply with environmental standards, there's a cost to that. You know, they're going to have to, say, for example, put a water treatment plant in their facility to make sure that they're not putting certain chemicals back into the water supply. Or they're going to have to put those scrubbers or things on their smokestacks and all to make sure that they're not putting certain things into the air, that sort of stuff. There's a cost associated with that, which is oftentimes the criticism of a lot of those policies, is that this is going to cost these companies too much. But that's actually part of the point, is because that will then cause them to pull back. Not only will that mean, you know, there's things happening, waste is not going into the environment, but it also, because of that additional cost, it's essentially, it works a lot like a tax by putting in those standards. Emissions taxes, we don't have too many of those around here, but certain states, they do have stricter emissions laws and emissions taxes that are paid by companies. You know, even I think even in some states, like when you drive a car, like as well as your car registration, you pay emissions taxes to try to incentivize people to not drive so much. You know, if we have to pay emissions taxes on our vehicles, then maybe people are less incentivized to drive, and therefore reduce the amount of pollution, because that lowers the amount of cars that are on the road. Okay, now negative externalities. We used pollution as an example. Other possible examples, and you can probably think of more, even things like barking dogs. Okay, that's an example of a negative externality because there's a cost associated with that, of course, depending on the location and the situation. But if your dog's up barking all night, if you have neighbors, what does that cost them? That costs them a good night's sleep as well. So there's negative externalities to that. Smoking is a huge negative externality, or contains huge negative externalities. Because not only is there a cost to that person who is utilizing cigarettes, but what is the overall social cost? People around them, secondhand smoke. That drives healthcare costs up because that's more people that get sick. That have chronic conditions. All of that is a strain on the healthcare system. So everybody pays the cost. All of society pays the cost. It's not just the person that pays the, I don't know, whatever it costs to buy a pack of cigarettes. We mentioned pollution, all other kind of, you know, any kind of health related stuff. You know, you could probably include a lot of, you know, a lot of processed foods and sugary drinks. And this is why, you know, cigarettes are taxed. That's one of the reasons to curb that behavior, is because there is a cost, not just to the person who's doing it, but there's a cost to society. That's why some states have tried to regulate sugary drinks like Cokes and stuff, and have put taxes on those, because there are external costs. You know, if I drink a sugary drink, no, that doesn't harm you by the way secondhand smoke does, but it could put strain on the healthcare system that would then be a problem for you as well. Now, positive externalities are those things that benefit not just the person who engages in the activity. Here's one we hear a lot about recently, especially this week, hopefully, vaccines. Vaccines have positive externalities, because if one person gets immunized against something, yes, that protects them, but how is that a benefit to society as a whole? That means they're not going to go around infecting other people with certain diseases. One of the reasons why a lot of folks that are not vaccinated don't get sick with stuff is because they live in a world where most people are. So there are positive externalities to that. It doesn't just benefit that person, it benefits other people they live with, people they interact with, all of that. Education is a positive externality. You know, a lot of folks say, well, I shouldn't have to pay taxes for education. I don't have kids. My children are already grown up, or whatever. But how do people, even if they're not the ones getting that education, how do they benefit from that? Ooh, a lot quieter there. You don't know. Don't we benefit from having an educated population? Don't we benefit from having people in our community that are going to be, you know, hireable, that are going to be good workers, that are going to be the people that are teaching the next generation, that are going to be the doctors, or even just going to be, you know, people doing blue collar jobs? You know, you want people that have some kind of education. There is a benefit to society there. You know, this a picture here of the construction on a house. If someone is fixing up their house and maybe putting in new siding or building a nice addition or fixing up their lawn or something like that, that's a positive has positive externalities to it. Because yeah, that's benefiting the person who's going to enjoy those improvements or those renovations, but who else does that benefit? The neighborhood around them. That means that everybody's going to get to enjoy looking at that attractive home. It's going to enhance the property value of the homes around it. Same way, if people are not keeping their house up. That's why, neighborhoods have covenants and rules about keeping things looking nice, and you can't do this, and you can't do that, or, and cities have, fines and stuff in some cases. Probably not in rural areas like this, but, fines if you don't keep your yard looking nice and all that kind of stuff, because it brings the property value down. Okay, so again, let's talk about how these are corrected, how they are graphed. And like I said, it is basically the same skill that we did with taxation, but you'd also, for positive externalities, you wouldn't tax. What could you do to encourage? Subsidize. So on the positive externalities, it's subsidies. So positive externalities means the market produces too little. Both of these result in deadweight loss. Now, this can be a little confusing because up until now, we've seen deadweight loss kind of appear in the same place. For positive externalities, or for some externalities, it may look a little bit different, or it may just be located in a different place. So just don't let that freak you out. Both of them produce some kind of deadweight loss. Okay, so in the case of positive externalities, the government might provide subsidies to encourage such activities, bringing those production levels to something that is more socially optimal. So, for example, with the hopefully upcoming COVID vaccine, government's footing the bill for it. Nobody's going to pay for it. They've said that no insurance, nobody will pay out of pocket for that. They want to incentivize people to get that vaccine. Okay, and they may do that sometimes for other vaccines, or there are some that are covered, some that are not. It all kind of depends. But those are ways that they can encourage that. Education, whether through subsidies, through loans, through grants, those are ways that they might encourage things like education. All other kinds of benefits they might try to offer, or incentives they may try to offer to people to consume more of those goods. So that's on the consumption side. So this graph shows us a positive externality. I know it's a positive externality because I'm showing the marginal social benefit as well as the marginal private benefit. And this is showing flu shot, okay? So here's the marginal private benefit. So that's the benefit, per every shot that is received for individual people. But there is an additional cost, an additional benefit to that. That's not taken into account in that demand curve. It does not take into account the additional benefits of the community when those people get immunized. So that's going to mean overall less people get sick, less strain on the healthcare system, all of that. So again, you have to look at it as if this demand curve is in the wrong place, and we want to get it in the right place. So we might subsidize. Here's the marginal social benefits. That's where we want it to be. Instead of being here, we want to be there. So they may provide subsidies, provide it for free, maybe go in and put in vaccination clinics, different things like that to encourage people and incentivize them to get that flu shot. Now, that will mean that, let me show you. It's easier on this one. Let me show you. Okay, so let me walk you through some examples again of a negative externality and how it can be corrected, and a positive one and how it can be corrected. And we'll see that deadweight loss again. Make sure don't let it freak you out. It can look a little bit different, but it's essentially the same thing. So here we have the market for cigarettes. This is showing us the demand curve, or the marginal social benefit, which in this case, since it's a negative externality, that's going to be the same as the marginal social cost. Then we have the marginal private, marginal private benefit. I said the wrong term there. Then we have our supply curve, and that represents only, though, the marginal private cost. It does not take into account the social cost, the additional cost to society when people buy cigarettes. So again, it means that this supply curve is in the wrong place. There is also a marginal social cost curve above that. This represents as additional cost to society. So this is the free market quantity. If there's no intervention, no government involvement, this is the quantity they're going to produce. This is the price that it's going to be. But this is really where we want it to be. So this is where taxes would come in. They might tax cigarettes in order to correct this particular market failure. Tax it to this point, meaning this is the price that people are going to pay. This is what consumers will keep. All this goes to the government, but what that does is it forces a smaller quantity. All right, thank you. All right, what am I saying? What am I doing? Okay. All right, and then of course we know that creates dead weight loss, which is all that right there. So at the quantity of the free market, QFM, the marginal social cost is greater than the marginal social benefit. Too much is produced, so there is dead weight loss, and we want to add a tax in so as to bring them to that more socially optimal point. Okay, now dead weight loss. Let's take a look at that because it's again a little bit different than what you're used to. Oh, wait, hold on. All right. So here's where we were in the free market. This is where they want to be. So the dead weight loss, you notice it looks a little bit weird in that. Let me go back a second. You can see. See how we used to, we would say it's like right there, and now it's like over here. So it's just in a little bit of a different place. Okay. Externalities, it's kind of, the best way to explain it is it's kind of on the other side with the externality. These are transactions that would have happened prior to any kind of intervention. But the purpose was these are transactions that we don't want to happen. Does that make any sense? Like these are the ones that are now not going to happen because there was a tax put in place, but that's a good thing, if that makes any kind of sense. Okay, so they will use a tax. We talked about that before, per unit tax, Pigouvian tax, whatever, to push the supply curve over to make marginal social benefit equal marginal social cost. Okay, let's look at a positive externality. So here we are, the market for flu shots in the absence of any kind of government intervention. So this is the quantity that the market would produce without any kind of intervention. Here is the price. But since this contains positive externalities, that demand curve only represents the marginal private benefit. It does not represent the additional benefits to society as a whole. That is represented by this, the marginal social benefit, okay? So this is the more socially optimal point. This is where we want society to produce, right there, okay? So in that case, we have a market failure because the marginal social benefit is meaning it's greater than the marginal private benefit. It's under allocating, okay? So that's creating dead weight loss like so. And then in order to get there, we might provide some kind of incentive, some kind of a subsidy, provide something for free, things like that, or at least no cost to the consumer to force them to produce at that particular place, to produce a greater quantity, okay? All right, let's see. Let's practice one. Okay, so let's just enter notes. Let's just practice real quick and see what we can come up with. So we're going to draw a correctly labeled diagram showing where a market without government intervention would determine the quantity of noise pollution from an airport in a small town. We're going to label that quantity A. Then we're going to assume the government intervenes and we're going to show an appropriate curve when the government levels a per unit tax. We're going to mark that MSC. We're going to show the new equilibrium and the socially optimal quantity, and then we're going to say what's true about those things at the socially optimal level.